So I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about game-based learning and some tips and tricks on how to include that in your own classroom and make an innovation that you haven't seen before. In this presentation, I do want to note that it is very interactive, so please take out your cell phones, take out your laptops, and engage with me because I'm going to be asking for some audience participation today. So I started my game-based learning journey with CI 202, and it was because I had a problem. If you want to read a little bit more about this, the publication is listed here, and this was recently published in Simulation and Gaming, and then the QR code on the side, if you have a QR code reader, you can point it at it and take a picture, and it'll take you right to that publication. But I had a problem with this course. I had taught courses like this before, and I had been very successful at it. I'd really enjoyed students and seeing them grow and learn. And CI 202 is a course that has about 100 students, and it is a course for future secondary education teachers. For those teachers, you know, that one class that they all have to take to get teacher certification. So I started teaching this course, and I realized that I had two problems. The first one was that, well, all the students weren't coming to class. It's kind of a big problem. And the second one was that the students that were coming to class, they weren't exactly prepared to come to class and to participate. So I had to take a really good look at how I was teaching the course and what I could do to make it a better learning experience for the students. So what I did is what any good educator would do. I reached out to my community. I looked online, I looked in social media, I looked in the research literature, and I found that I was really excited by the idea of using bits of games, especially the really motivating ones, and pulling them into my classroom. And I had looked and seen other educators that were doing something similar, and I thought, I can do that too. So here's what I did. I made some big changes. First off, I changed the structure of the class. This is a class full of mostly sophomores, some juniors, and what I did was change it from a traditional lecture lab to something very different. At first, it was a Tuesday, Thursday lecture, and they had to also go to a lab sometime in the beginning of the week. I flipped that around using a little bit of the flip model, and I changed it so that it was a blended course. Meaning at the beginning of the week, the students had to work online. They had to do different activities. Then they came to me on Thursdays for lecture, and then Fridays for lab. So I changed the layout of the course, how they actually did it. I also went back to the content, and I took it down to scratch. And part of my struggle with this course was every secondary teacher is in this class, meaning I have everyone from PE teachers to history teachers, to science teachers, to ag ed teachers, and they're all in the same class. So what I did is I made the online portion a little bit more differentiated. They had lots of readings and activities, and some of them were meant for different content areas. They also had a discussion board and a quiz. And the quiz they could take 3 times for a high score. They really enjoyed that part of it. You'd be surprised if they would say that the quiz is their favorite part, but they are very used to quizzes at that level, and they really liked that they could take it multiple times. Then I changed it up, so when they came to lecture, it wasn't a traditional lecture where it was me standing in front. There was a lot of group work. And in this group work, we had a lot of games and competition, and we had different activities and case studies. It was very active. I also made sure that it's scaffolded with challenge over the week so that these quests that I called, which were these weekly units, they were thematic, that as they went through the week, it got more and more difficult. They started out with basic information, and they worked their way up to more challenging information. And the way they ended was in lab. So before, lab was somewhere in the beginning of the week, and now it was at the very end. It was like a capstone element to the week. And in this ending period, they had 3 challenges. And they worked in groups to complete a challenge that was very hands-on, and they couldn't move on to the next challenge until they completed the first one. And they couldn't move on to the third challenge until they completed the second. So it's scaffolded in that way as well. It was also now points-based. As you can see, I made a lot of changes. It was also points-based. So we no longer relied on grades. We relied on points. And there were lots of ways that students can earn points. From everything they did in the class, plus additional items. They could take these side quests and earn extra points. So what does my classroom look like now? Well, it looks a little bit more like this. So imagine that picture times 100 students. Students all over the floor, working in groups, working in the hallway. Very loud and noisy, sometimes very competitive, but a fun class, and that's how I designed it. So being the researcher that I am, I thought, well, I need to take some data here and see how it's going. I think it's going well, but how is it going for the students? So here are some of the results of the data analysis for this class. Now, to compare this to the class before was very difficult because it really wasn't the same class at all. But when you look at the class the way I use game-based learning, here were the results. For that online part of the class, I wasn't so sure that they were actually going to do it on their own, but they did. And as you can see from the quiz completion rate, almost everyone in the class took the quiz. Now, I said to you a little bit ago that there were 3 chances to do well, and you got a high score on the quiz. Interestingly, I found that about 1/3 of the class took the quiz once, 1/3 of it took it twice, and about 1/3 of it took it 3 times every time. So they were using that opportunity to retake the quizzes. I even had some students that said to me that they were kind of gaming the system a little bit, and they would go look at the quiz first and take it once and fail it because they knew it was okay because they could take it again. And then they would go do the readings and go do the assignments and come back and see if they could get the right answers. And that was okay with me. And part of the interesting bit for them was there was a pool of questions that the quiz came from, so they weren't guaranteed to have the same questions more than once. Also, what was extremely important to me as the educator was that they were coming to class, and they were. So as you can see, over 90%, they were attending, and they were also prepared to come. So for me, it was a great experience, although it was a lot of work, and that's something we'll talk about a little bit more here in the presentation. Okay, so that's a little bit about myself, but let's move on a little bit about all of you. So I want to focus this talk on how you can use game-based learning in your own classroom and some strategies for that. Now, yesterday I was in the Games and Simulation SIG. So if anyone's in that SIG, if you could wave your hand really tall for a minute so people can see. Okay. And one of the things that came up was, how do we even define game-based learning? So we spent a good amount of our time just discussing that. And that's part of the problem that you might see up here. It's a little bit of a mess, a different mess than Mark Prensky was talking about the other day. But it is a mess in itself. And in the research literature, it's something that we're still struggling with. Part of the problem with this is that we are a field in game-based learning that pulls from so many other places. And from all of these other places, we have different perspective of what these different words mean and how they're used in our field. And that's why we have so many terms out there. So I want to focus with you today on 2 terms. Game-based learning and gamification. And I want to share with you my own perspective of those terms so that we can all be on the same page. Okay, so game-based learning and perspective. My perspective comes from the learning sciences. That's my background, and when I use terms like this, I'm considering terms like problem-based learning and project-based learning and how we use that in our field. And if you think about it that way, then you're going to see my perspective that it's not just curriculum and not just planning curriculum, but it's more than that. It's the entire ecosystem of the classroom. It's how people interact together, it's how the environment is set up, and it's the activities that occur. So the way that I define game-based learning is as a pedagogy, and not just a way of defining curriculum. It's a pedagogy where the learning experience is structured using game mechanics. So your next question might be, well, then what are game mechanics? Let me give you some examples of that. So that is also another area in our field that, depending on who you ask, they might have a different opinion of what is included in game mechanics. But I really like it when people divide it into two different areas. The first area is more of, you can think, the core of the game. And these are sometimes called game attributes. In this core of the game, it's kind of like the behind the scenes, what the student might not necessarily notice about the game. It's how the instructor pulls the narrative throughout, or how interactions are designed. And then there's this upper level, and that's a level that students usually notice first. And sometimes those are called game elements. And a good example of that would be leaderboards, or badges, or leveling. Things that the students see right away, and it impacts them directly. So we have these two different levels. Okay, so from my definition here, if we're looking at game-based learning in this way, we're considering games that have both game attributes and game elements as part of game-based learning. It is the entire package. Now, if I compare that to gamification, that's a little different. So gamification is a word that is used interchangeably with game-based learning sometimes. And it's definitely a term that's popular with business and industry, because it's easy for them to just take one thing out of a game and put it into their system. So for example, if a Fortune 500 company had a training program that people weren't very excited about, they might want to increase motivation by just adding badges. So every time someone completes a different area of their training, they get a badge. That would be considered gamification. It is isolated game elements put into a context without that core structure. So it's not the entire package. All right, so that's where I'm coming from with my definition of the two. And because of that, that'll help you all understand the rest of the presentation. And you can debate it on your own later if you agree with me or not. All right, now, I did say that this presentation was interactive. So you will notice here that there's two question marks. There is an up direction in this presentation, and there is a right direction. So in a second here, there's a poll that's going to show up. So take out your laptop or your cell phone, and you can vote in the poll. Which way, as an audience, do you want to go next? Do you want to go up, which is A, or do you want to go right, which is B? You can do this on your laptop by typing in that web address or texting the number A or B. Look like A is the winner so far. Up, B. Close. Oh, we can't have a tie. Okay. It looks like, although B keeps changing slightly, it looks like A is the winner. I'm going to call it. A is the winner. So we're going to go that direction. Hold on. If I can move my mouse. There we go. Okay. Good choice. Although you'll never know what was the other direction. All right, so because you chose this way, this is actually another example of mine that I'm going to share with you. So the example I shared with you about 202 is game-based learning, but it is not very immersive, right? It's still the same kind of content that I would have taught previously, even though the structure did change. This one right here is a class I'm working on with faculty in financial literacy. They teach a very large class that has hundreds of students each semester and is completely online. And it's a 1-credit class. And what they asked me to do was to help them increase the motivation and engagement of students in the class. So what we did is we took their content down and we redid it from the ground up and we made it a game. And this game is called Money Hero. Now I want you to notice two things about this game. The first one is you get part of your grade by completing assignments, and part of your grade is in a bank. All right. Now you can get money for your bank and you can lose money in your bank. So in this bank, think of it as like the game of life. You know that game, right? Where you have a little card and you have the people on the board and things happen to you. And if you don't have health insurance or car insurance, you lose a lot of money. So that's the same strategy that we used here. So I'm going to show you the little promo that the students see at the beginning of the class. So that's the course. We've been running it in pilot for the past year, and the results are really good. We've been looking at the data, so I don't have any results to share with you now, but the engagement is definitely up. But also, there's more work to do. There's things from it that we need to fine-tune, and it takes time to make one of these kind of courses run really smoothly. So that's Money Hero. All right, a few minutes ago, I shared with you my own definition of game-based learning. But unfortunately, that's pretty broad. And that kind of definition isn't really going to help you incorporate a game into your classroom or make your classroom a game. It's much easier to figure all of this out by looking at the types of games. Because even within different types of games, there are different strategies that make the game successful or not successful. And there are different patterns of gameplay that are very normal in those types of games. So let's go through some of these game types, and I'll give you little tips along the way about what you can do to use that type of game. All right, the first category I want to look at is role-playing and adventure games. In this type of game, the most important thing, obviously, is the story. Because you want to get your classroom immersed in the story of the game. You want them to feel like they're in that time period, or they're in the future, or they're wherever you happen to put them in a textbook, that they're really there and they're immersed. And if you do that, you want them to feel like they want to move forward in the game. So not only is the story extremely important, but the goal that you set for them to reach is also extremely important. So have an engaging backstory and game goals. Also, when you're trying to develop a game that's story-based, it needs to be very creative. And as much as creativity as we have as teachers, you'd be surprised at the creativity of students. So when you are creating a story game, you create the story, you try it out with students, and then when you're done, you can't just stop. You have to take the time to debrief with your students. Now, debriefing is that reflective period outside the game where you are looking back in and saying, how did it go? And in story-based games, you'd be surprised at what great additions to the story the students can have for you. So it's a really important element to come back at the end and say, hey, this is the story I created for you. I thought it went pretty well, but how would you all have made it different? So getting the input of the students is extremely important. Now on the bottom of this slide, you'll see a pattern. Now this pattern is an example of one way that you could run a game that's based on a story. It could be, let's say it was a story from a book, and you were going to have different events that happened in a popular book of literature that you were going to read with your students. It doesn't have to be increasingly challenging over the time that they're spending. It can just be different. So for example, you could introduce one element of the story in a week, and then the next week you introduce a second element of the story, and the next week a different element of the story as they move along, so that you can see the picture goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One thing with stories, though, is if everyone is going in the same direction, you're going to lose people, because you're not really giving them choice and you're not engaging their interest along the way. So with this type of activity, you want to have side quests. You want to have a way for them to pick out one element of the story and go that direction or go that direction. So that's represented here in that diagram. I want to give you an example of a teacher that did this. This is a high school teacher named Paul Darvasi, and he is extremely creative, and he was having his own problem, and he decided to make a story-type game for his classroom. I want to share with you this clip because he talks about how he came up with the story. And that, to me, is sometimes the most challenging part, is coming up with that initial idea.
So the idea germinated in the back of my head, and 3 years later, I was up very late one night in April, trying to work my way through a lesson plan for Ken Kesey's One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The lesson would be for my grade 12 class, and it was very late in the year, and these guys had essentially checked out. And I wanted to do something different and creative, and nothing was coming to me. And I was exhausted and sort of stressed out. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, a very strange image popped into my mind. I was sitting at my desk in school, tapping away on my keyboard, except for I was wearing a nurse's cap with a big red cross on it, very much like Nurse Ratched's cap in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And this strangely opened a floodgate to my imagination, and I thought, why not turn One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest into a game? Why don't I become Nurse Ratched, turn the school into an asylum, and my students into patients? And so I started sketching out the design for this game and thinking about what video game mechanics and game mechanics could meaningfully externalize the narrative in a way that would bring it to life for my students.
I always love that. The school's the asylum and the students are patients. Don't we all feel like that sometimes? Okay, so that gives me an idea how sometimes it just comes to you. You're struggling with an issue, a problem, and for his example, the students just weren't being motivated. It was the end of the year, and he needed something to catch their attention, and that's what he developed. If you want to see how he did it, he actually has a really nice